Whoever, for devotion alone, not to gain honor or money, goes to Jerusalem to liberate the Church of God can substitute this journey for all penance. These were the words spoken by Pope Urban II during the Council of Clermont. These words led to the First Crusade of the 11th century and would inspire future crusades to the east. These crusades led to millions of deaths and the suffering of people throughout the next 2 centuries. The Crusades were important to the history of Jerusalem and many other places they ventured to. The Christians acted in response to the Islamic invasions that had happened centuries ago and continued after the Crusades. These Islamic invaders were also quite brutal, but not too much on those just yet, as that will be a future topic on this channel. Stick around to find out the tales of the Crusaders throughout the Middle Ages on a day in history. Background on the Crusades. The Crusades were holy conquests that started in 1095 and continued for centuries. These crusades were usually sponsored by the Latin Church in the West against non-Christians in the East, usually Muslim and Jewish peoples. Many men that were involved believed that their participation in the Crusades would help rid themselves of the sins they had committed in their lives. The Roman Catholic Church was at the center of the Crusades as the Crusaders got support for their wars from the leadership at the church. Jerusalem was at the heart of the struggle since it was a holy city to Christians. Jerusalem to the Christians was where Jesus preached, died, and eventually resurrected himself. The idea that non-Christians inhabited and ruled the holy city infuriated the Christian raiders and may account for the brutality shown to the people within Jerusalem. There would be many crusades after the initial one for the conquest of Jerusalem. There is also scholarly debate as to which conflicts and events to even call a crusade. After the defeats in later Crusader campaigns, the need to have a crusade decreased. The Islamic had begun to have a more unified front to defend themselves from the Crusaders, and the religious fervor of the 11th century faded. The idea of keeping Europe Christian, however, did not fade, as the Reconquista in the 15th century showed that Europe was still determined to be a Christian stronghold. The expulsion and murders of Jewish and Muslim populations in Spain were a continuation of the sentiments from the Crusades. The good. To start on a positive note, there were a few good things that came from the Crusades. The flow of information improved between the East and West, as new information regarding medicine had come about. Muslim scholars had introduced many mathematical concepts to Western Europe, like the concept of zero and their use of the number system made up of 1, 2, 3, and so on. During the Crusades, trade thrived between Islamic traders and Europeans. Exotic goods were introduced to the European markets such as pepper and cinnamon. Goods like sugar, pistachios, and watermelons are only some of the items introduced to Europe. After the successful conquest of Jerusalem after the First Crusade, Jerusalem was built up by the Christians that inhabited the city afterward. Eventually, the city was reconquered by Saladin, the Sultan of the area of Syria and the founder of the Ayyubid dynasty. The reconquering forces marveled at how the Crusaders had transformed the city, with palaces and churches made of marble. From Jordan to Syria and Turkey, the remains of the castles and palaces built by the Crusaders can still be seen to this day. The bad. The Crusades as a whole led to an increase in the persecution of Jewish people across Europe. During the Second Crusade, around 10% of the Jewish population in England was exterminated by Crusader violence. The Children's Crusade was an example of how even children were not immune to the allure of conquest aroused by the Church. In 1212, children from northern France and Germany decided to gather under the shepherd boy Stephen of Cloire. Stephen had claimed that a letter from Jesus himself was to be delivered to the King of France, but upon arrival, the king ordered them to scatter. They decided to march to the Holy City anyways and reach the city of Genoa in Italy. The crusade itself was a complete failure, with the Crusaders not being able to find a ship to the Holy Land. They either ended up dead, enslaved, or forced to become a laborer. The promises of the Church and Crusaders of the past led these people to failure. The ugly. The Crusades led to human suffering across multiple continents. It is estimated that millions of people died as a result of them, and from both sides of the conflict. The First Crusade is arguably the bloodiest of the Crusades, as there are several medieval accounts detailing the events that transpired in 1096. The objective of the First Crusade was the retaking of Jerusalem from the non-Christians. There had been reports of Christians within the city being mistreated and not taken care of equally. The Pope had promised that forgiveness of one's sins would be given to the people of the Crusades. The First Crusade on Jerusalem was a horrid affair, with the Crusaders' siege on the city a success. The Crusaders led a full-on siege of Jerusalem and the massacre of its inhabitants. The southern French chronicler Raymond of Aguilera was a knight that participated in the First Crusade and wrote the book History of the Frankish Conquerors of Jerusalem, or the Historia for short. In this chronicle, he recounts his experiences and eyewitness account of the Crusade. The details he described are horrid. A merciful death, according to him, was being beheaded. The crueler deaths involved being tortured for extended periods of time and subsequently thrown into flames to slowly burn to death. The raiders used their arrows to pierce their enemies from towers. The carnage was all around the city, with various limbs scattered about the city, which included heads and feet. The holy city was littered with corpses, and the knights had no choice but to trample the deceased bodies as they progressed through the city. According to some historians, besides the need to cleanse the city of non-Christians, the Crusaders decided to systematically murder the city's inhabitants to prevent an uprising or be responsible for splitting the scarce resources in Jerusalem's tough environment. The execution of these people was of high priority, which meant the Crusaders paused their looting to mercilessly slaughter the Muslim and Jewish people. A few were spared to help move the bodies out of the city in order, and even those people were executed once the task had been finished. Fulcher of Chartres, a priest at the time, visited the city and noted the awful smell from the dead bodies that littered the outside. Jewish people, having heard of the incoming invaders, killed themselves and the rest of their family as to not die from the hands of the Crusaders. The Rhineland Massacres, also known as the German Crusade of 1096, was another instance of great violence by Crusaders in the 11th century. Jewish historians believe this event was a precursor to the 20th century Holocaust of the Jewish people inflicted upon by Nazi Germany. During the actual massacre, around 2,000 Jewish people died, and the Crusaders made it known that the Jewish people had to either convert or face death. Many Jewish people decided on the latter. Jewish men, in an act of martyrdom, decided to kill themselves and their families. Another woman named Rachel decided to slay her children in order for the Christians to not raise them in their ways. The Crusaders may have blamed the Jewish people for the death of Jesus Christ, which filled them with great hatred. These acts of violence would continue throughout the Crusades. Another brutal tale of the Crusades was the massacre at Ayadi. This event was the result of the Third Crusade from 1189 to 1193. King Richard I of England had 2,000 prisoners of war from the previously mentioned Sultan of Egypt and Syria, Saladin. The Sultan also had 1,600 Christian prisoners in his possession. A deal had to be made to exchange the prisoners. Richard I demanded the cross upon which Jesus was crucified, gold, and all the prisoners safely returned. Saladin had agreed, but this is where the tricky part comes in. Who was to release the other prisoners first? The two rivals distrusted the other. Richard I was not content and believed Saladin to be stalling for time. Richard I subsequently had all 2,000 prisoners executed. He had his army take the prisoners to a small hill named Ayadi that was in clear view from Saladin's army. Richard I commanded them to be beheaded in view of the army. This infuriated Saladin, who had the need for revenge. Saladin had the 1,600 Christian prisoners executed as revenge. The news was not contained to the army, and the story of what had happened spread. Christian prisoners throughout Saladin's empire were tortured and murdered in retaliation. This breaking down of negotiations led to death on both sides of the table and just one of the brutal Crusader stories. Conclusion: The Crusades were a bloody and chaotic time in European and Middle Eastern history. Jewish and Muslim people were targeted by the Christians from the West and mercilessly slaughtered in the city of Jerusalem. Even to this day, some Christians feel the need to apologize for the actions of people from hundreds of years ago. In 1999, a group of European and American Christians visited the holy city of Jerusalem to apologize for the slaughtering of the people in the city. The Crusades changed life in the West and East forever. Now, don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel to get our eternal blessing.